A year into the coronavirus pandemic and the race between virus and vaccine entered a new phase. In Central Asia and the Caucasus, the path to recovery is expected to be long and divergent. To understand what policies can be effective to save livelihoods and promote economic rehabilitation in the region, Mr. Jihad Azour of the International Monetary Fund has joined me today. Mr. Azur, thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.
After its emergence, the COVID-19 pandemic is still ravaging our economies. 1 year into the pandemic, where does the Central Asian region stand?
Well, we are, as you said, a year into the pandemic. Countries in the region were able to address the first wave of the pandemic shock by introducing certain number of measures on the fiscal, monetary, and financial sector side in order to protect the economy and as well as also protect lives. Now we are at a turning point. 2020 was a year where across the region growth has suffered. Of course, oil exporting Caucasus and Central Asian countries with the capacity to respond thanks to the buffers they were able to recover faster. 2021 is going to be, in terms of outlook, determined by three factors. First, of course, is the vaccine, and the race between vaccine and virus will be determined. In the region, countries like Kazakhstan, for example, is on the leading compared to other countries in Caucasus and Central Asia, both in terms of diversity of sourcing as well as also rapidity of inoculation. The second factor that will play also an important role is policies. Extending the policies that were introduced will be important. Of course, it will depend on the capacity of each country to sustain those. But it's important not to withdraw prematurely those policies. And three is how to prepare for strong and sustainable recovery that requires to invest in more structural issues, building the capacity for the technology, for the green economy to lead growth, address some of the issues that emerge like SOEs, deal with the scarring of some sectors that were more affected, and protect the economy against any volatility in interest rates or in capital flows.
Mr. Azur, as you have mentioned, obviously vaccination will play a major and key role in the economic rebound. However, access to adequate vaccine supplies remains a challenge for many countries in the region. Early inoculators like Kazakhstan are planning to have the significant portion of the population inoculated before the end of 2021. However, some countries in the region are not expected to have vaccinated the majority of their population until at least mid-2022. How do you think that will affect the economic recovery and the relations between the countries?
Well, of course, as we show in our Outlook update, delaying the vaccination will have a direct impact on growth. Countries who are able to accelerate vaccination could get an additional growth of 1 percentage point by 2022. Those who are late inoculator will suffer from that. And things also are linked. You cannot open the economy, attract tourism, re-engage into service activities without having a certain level of herd immunity. Therefore, this is why we consider vaccine is very important. Second, I think after this crisis, as we are entering into recovery where advanced economies are regaining the momentum of the pre-pandemic growth, I think for the region, it's an opportunity, and this needs to be put into good use. The East-West corridor, the fact that there is a new interest in regional integration, as well as also opening new markets. This is for Caucasus and Central Asia an opportunity. Of course, there are some additional challenges in certain countries, but yet, I think what one could say is by the end of 2021, Caucasus and Central Asia will be able to recover the lost ground in 2020 and regain the same level of growth of 2019. Of course, reforming the SOEs will open a new potential for growth. Banking system, monetary policy proved to be useful during this crisis, and therefore strengthening the financial system, making sure that when you unwind the various measures, this will not affect the stability of the corporate sector. Those are things that will allow the region to accelerate its recovery.
Now, since you have started talking about the vulnerabilities to the economies, in the region, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan remain the world's two most remittance-reliant countries. How are they faring currently, and what is the forecast for them moving forward?
Well, of course, countries who are dependent on remittances were more vulnerable, like countries who are dependent on tourism, for example, Georgia. In other parts of the world, remittances were more resilient than in Caucasus and Central Asia. And maybe this is because of the nature or the sources of remittances. Now with the recovery regaining momentum, both in China, Russia, and other economic partners, we expect that the lost ground in 2020 will be regained gradually. Of course, I think technology showed that you can, through mobile banking, through financial inclusion, allow better transmission of remittances, more fluidity, reducing the cost, and all these elements are positive for countries that are dependent on other economies for their growth.
Mr. Azur, let's talk about the oil market. Oil prices fell to $27 per barrel in April 2020, exactly a year ago. But the prices reached $67 per barrel mid-March and traded at 4.5% higher than 2019 average. What is the forecast for oil prices in 2021?
Well, in the last 12 months, we saw oil at low 20s and now has recovered, as you rightly said, to the levels of early 2020. However, expectations are showing that given the level of recovery globally, oil price will remain in the corridor of mid-50s. Countries that rely on oil and gas who have started to diversify their economy should accelerate that. And this is particularly for countries where both the current account as well as also the fiscal accounts are dependent on oil and oil revenues. In the case of Caucasus, like for example, Kazakhstan is less, for example, if you compare with the GCC, because the economy is more diversified and there are additional sources of income. Still, I think it's very important to build forward better by starting a long-term transformation where reliance on energy and energy-related activities will be less. And I think the strategy that, for example, in the case of Kazakhstan, the government has adopted recently in terms of diversification, in terms of industrialization, it's a step in the right direction. And here, the role of the private sector is going to be very supportive for that.
Mr. Azur, at the same time, non-fuel commodity prices, particularly food prices, rose in the second half of 2020 and are expected to remain elevated this year. The IMF's food price index is expected to rise to 14% in 2021. How do you think that will affect the economies here, and how will that affect the poverty rate in the region?
It's indeed an issue because although it may not affect the overall inflation rates, but it affects the level of people, especially the low and middle income people, because the portion of basic food and commodities constitute an important part of their budget. And therefore, it's very important to expand the various social programs that were introduced during the crisis. I think the crisis brought some silver linings, and one of them is to expand the social programs, use new means of channeling a basic income for certain vulnerable groups. Extending those programs, targeting them to make sure that they are helping those who are in need, it's the right policies, at least for the short term. For the medium term, there is no better than creating jobs and improving the quality of those jobs. And therefore, investing in education, investing in technical capacity building, those are important elements to allow people to move from one sector to another without losing their competitiveness or their income level.
Mr. Azur, is this to say that labor market conditions will remain weak and uneven during this year? Because labor market outcomes have deteriorated throughout this pandemic across the region, and especially for the youth in the region.
Well, as you know, this crisis affected job-rich sectors like tourism, like retail, and in the region, the portion of the informal sector is high relatively compared to other parts of the world. And therefore, you have certain activities and sectors that are more vulnerable. And those need to be supported, at least in this transition. And there are two ways of supporting them. Improving access to finance, especially for small companies, and for those who need to change jobs, helping them to get and acquire the new skills for the new type of jobs. And therefore, this is where the role of state is going to be.
Mr. Azur, capital flows to emerging markets decreased last year. What is the forecasted trend for the whole year, and how is that affecting the regional economies?
Last year, we saw, in fact, two movements. We saw in the beginning of the crisis a massive outflow and gradual return to capital flows to the region. I think it's important to separate between two things. Portfolio flows that recovered faster and FDIs that are slow in recovery. And for FDIs to recover, you need to open opportunities for investment. And to open opportunities for investment, it's important to reform the state-owned enterprises, improve business environment, improve access to finance, and also improve the overall stability in those economies. Therefore, I think it's very important to work on two levels. One is working on improving the overall risk profile. This will help attract portfolio flows, but also improve the business environment, the competitiveness of the economy, which will serve to help in recovering FDIs.
Mr. Azur, different governments in the region have been able to respond with a variety of monetary and fiscal tools and policies to the crisis caused by the pandemic. Exchange rate flexibility absorbed some of the shocks initially. However, countries with flexible exchange rate like Armenia, Kazakhstan, Georgia have seen their currencies depreciate in 2020, and there have been exchange rate interventions for some of the cases. Other countries and central banks of these countries have responded with cuts of their base rates. Which of the policies have proven effective, and what would you recommend moving further?
Well, what we saw over the last year is telling us that there are three important criteria. One is to have a targeted policy measures, timely, in order to respond to the need of the moment, and adapted. Adapted in the timing as well as also in the focus. In addition to that, the right mix between monetary, fiscal, and financial is also important. On the monetary side, especially countries who have adopted flexible exchange rate, allow the flexibility of the exchange rate to help cushion the pressure of the shock, making sure that while you are allowing additional liquidity to go to the private sector, to start a triage between companies who can recover and those who will not be able to recover. And the last is separate between two things. Support the engine of the economy and support people. Supporting people, the best way is through social transfers. This has proven to be the best way, and there are different forms: cash transfers, unemployment allowances, and other type of direct support. In the medium term, reforming the labor market will be also very useful.
With the recent flare-up in the new COVID-19 cases, with new variants of the virus being found in some of the countries in the region, new restriction measures and lockdowns, forms of lockdowns have been introduced in the countries. And however, restrictions have been made, although the kind of support, the kind of monetary, social support that was provided last year was not replicated this year for most countries. And what do you think the adequate amount of help and government support should be at the moment?
Well, of course, the best and the first to do is to accelerate vaccination. Inoculation of the vaccine help people protect their life and allow them also to expand their activities. In addition to that, it's very important also to learn from the first wave. And I think countries have learned from the first wave in adjusting the way they provide or put in place measures in terms of confinement, in terms of control. Three is to maintain at least fiscal stimulus that helps provide people with a minimum of livelihood and protect their basic income. And this is something that is still needed, at least for some time.
Mr. Azur, Central Asia and Caucasus was seen as a promising region with emerging markets before the pandemic. Now, the COVID-19 crisis has been a major blow to the growth of the economies in the region. Where do you see the region heading towards after this pandemic?
Well, the issue is, like maybe other parts of the world, we see divergence in the economy. And I think this is the real challenge going forward. Divergence between countries as well as a divergence between groups in each country. Those who have access to the vaccine, those who have a good level of income are going to be better protected. On the production side, industries have proven to be more resilient than, for example, services or retail. Therefore, this divergence is an issue, and an issue that we need to work on. And this would require for government to have targeted policies, very dynamic, very agile, timely ones, in order to provide the right remedy at the right time. The region has a potential because we see a new cycle of globalization or global organization. And with this new global order, the region has its place, has the capacity to play an important role. And I think this is where the focus should be. The focus should be in creating greater space of trade, exchange, and investment, and create a market that could go up to 100 million. Increase the linkages with East, China, Russia, and also with the West, with Europe. Improve the functioning of the economy by increasing productivity of labor, of capital, and strengthen the stability and solvency of the financial sector too.
Mr. Azur, according to the latest IMF outlook, the regional output is to reach 3.7% in 2021. Economic growth is forecasted for the next year, and the GDP growth in the region will reach 4% by 2025. What will generate growth? Where do you think growth coming from?
Well, it depends. Growth is coming from, I would say, the sectors that were less affected than others. Industrial sector, productive sector were less affected than others, and therefore their recovery is faster. And we are showing it in our outlook that contact-intensive sectors, like, for example, retail, like tourism and services, were more affected. Of course, now with the reactivation of the global value chain, this will be a new acceleration of recovery. The oil market or the oil sector, it depends on the countries. Countries who are bound by the OPEC plus limitation of production, although oil price is going up, they will not see the full benefit of it. They see the benefit of it in their balance of payment and in their fiscal accounts. And I think acceleration of vaccination will in itself reactivate the that require social interaction. And then this is expected to become a driver of growth in the second half of 2021.
Mr. Azur, we all have had a long and an exhausting year. Everybody feels very tired of the bad news. What do you see as some of the silver linings, although it may be hard to talk about them just now, and perhaps some of the opportunities that should be seized by the countries in the region amidst this crisis?
Well, there are different types of silver linings. I think clearly at the country level, we saw the resilience of certain number of sectors and activities. We saw also acceleration of certain trends, technology, for example, environmental investment. Now, those are accelerations of trends that existed maybe before, but those are going to offer an important potential of growth going forward. You have also, I think, possibility to create a further regional cooperation in the Caucasus and Central Asia. And three, that the role of the state is efficient, but the role of the state doesn't mean that the state should be bigger in size. Take, for example, in Kazakhstan recently, the government has developed a new medium-term strategy with a clear ambition to diversify further the economy, increase the role of certain number of activities, attract FDIs. This is going to be what countries need. And moving with the resolve, setting the right institutional framework for that, and finding the right balance between preserving stability and accelerating the recovery is going to be the best approach for countries in the region.
Dr. Azur, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.